It was the 3rd of May, 1945, and Harry Truman had been president for exactly 21 days. The weight of the office sat heavy on his shoulders as he worked late into the night in the Oval Office, surrounded by boxes containing Franklin Roosevelt's personal papers. Most of what he found was ordinary, the kind of correspondence and notes you'd expect from any president. But then Truman came across something that would change everything. Hidden in a locked drawer that required a special key was a leather portfolio marked with 2 words that made his pulse quicken: personal and confidential. When he opened it, he found a large map of Europe, beautifully detailed and covered in Roosevelt's own distinctive handwriting. As Truman leaned closer to study what he was looking at, the color drained from his face, because what he saw on that map would haunt him for the rest of his life. The map showed dozens of Nazi concentration camps scattered across occupied Europe, each one marked with a small red pin. Names that would become synonymous with horror were written there: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Majdanek, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. Next to each red pin, in Roosevelt's careful script, were dates and numbers. The dates went back to 1942, 3 full years before this moment, meaning Roosevelt had known about the death camps for 3 years while the war raged on. The numbers written beside each location represented estimates of how many people were being murdered there, and the figures were absolutely staggering. Tens of thousands at some camps, hundreds of thousands at others. But what made Truman feel physically sick wasn't simply that Roosevelt had known about the camps, it was what else appeared on the map. Drawn in blue ink across the page were railway lines connecting the camps to major transportation hubs throughout Germany and Poland. And on several of these railway lines, Roosevelt had written careful notes in his own hand. Bombed February 44. Destroyed March 44, hit April 44. These were records of Allied bombing raids on German industrial and transportation targets. And as Truman stared at the map, a horrifying realization began to dawn on him. Roosevelt had been tracking which railway lines had been bombed. But more importantly, he had deliberately avoided bombing the railway lines that led directly to the death camps. Truman sat down heavily in his chair, still gripping the map in trembling hands, and immediately called for his appointment's secretary, Matthew Connolly, asking him to locate Secretary of War Henry Stimson right away. It was nearly midnight, but Truman didn't care about the hour. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Stimson arrived within 60 minutes, looking exhausted and deeply worried when he saw the expression on Truman's face. Truman spread the map across his desk without saying anything at first, then finally spoke just 4 words. "Explain this to me." Stimson studied the map for what felt like forever, his face showing both recognition and something that looked uncomfortably like shame. Then he took a deep breath and said that what Truman was looking at represented a decision President Roosevelt had made back in 1943, a decision that many people in the administration had disagreed with at the time. Stimson began to explain the terrible truth that Truman was only now discovering. Starting in 1942, intelligence reports had begun reaching the Roosevelt administration about Nazi extermination camps. And while the initial reports were fragmented and difficult to verify, by the middle of 1943 the evidence had become overwhelming and impossible to deny. Jewish refugees who had managed to escape from Poland brought first-hand testimony about what they had witnessed. Polish resistance fighters provided detailed information about the locations and operations of the camps. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by Allied planes showed the camps in stark detail. British intelligence agencies confirmed everything the other sources were saying. The Nazi regime was systematically murdering millions of Jews. Roma people, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and others in industrial-scale killing facilities that had been specifically designed for mass murder. Once this horrible truth became undeniable, The question facing Allied leaders became what should be done about it. Jewish organizations throughout America and Britain began desperately pleading with Roosevelt and Churchill to bomb the railway lines leading to the camps, particularly to Auschwitz-Birkenau, which had become the largest killing center in the entire Nazi system. The argument these organizations made was straightforward and logical. Destroy the rail lines, and you would disrupt the Nazis' ability to transport victims to the gas chambers, and even temporary disruptions would save thousands of lives because the trains couldn't run without functioning tracks. The appeals were passionate and desperate because people were dying by the thousands every single day, and anything that could slow down the killing machine seemed worth doing. But Roosevelt said no, and according to Stimson, Roosevelt's reasoning was cold and calculated in a way that prioritized military strategy over human life. The president argued that the primary mission of the Allied forces was to win the war as quickly as possible, and that every bomber diverted to attack concentration camp infrastructure would be one less bomber attacking German factories, oil refineries, and military targets that were directly supporting the Nazi war machine. Roosevelt believed that the fastest way to end the Holocaust was to defeat Nazi Germany completely and utterly, and that attacking the camps or the railways, leading to them, would be merely a symbolic gesture that might save some lives in the short term but would ultimately prolong the war and therefore cost more lives overall in the long run. Truman listened to this explanation with mounting anger building inside him, and he interrupted Stimson to ask whether anyone had challenged this reasoning, whether anyone had told Roosevelt that it might be possible to do both, to bomb military targets and also bomb the railways to the death camps. Stimson nodded slowly and admitted that yes, several people had argued exactly that point. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau had been particularly insistent about it, even bringing Jewish leaders to meet directly with Roosevelt and presenting detailed plans, showing how bombing the railways could be accomplished without significantly impacting the broader bombing campaign against German industry. Roosevelt had listened to all of these arguments, heard everyone out, and still said no. What Stimson didn't tell Truman that night, but what Truman would discover over the following weeks as he dug deeper into the records, was that Roosevelt's decision was even more complicated and darker than simple military strategy, because there were political calculations involved, specifically domestic political calculations about American public opinion. Roosevelt had been deeply concerned about how Americans viewed Jewish refugees and the war effort in general. There was significant anti-Semitism throughout America in the 1940s, something that's uncomfortable for us to acknowledge today, but was very real at the time. Opinion polls conducted during the war showed that many Americans opposed accepting large numbers of Jewish refugees into the country. Roosevelt worried that if he made the Holocaust too central to America's stated war aims, it would create a backlash among certain segments of the American population. Roosevelt had privately told his advisors that he couldn't allow the war to be perceived as a war being fought primarily to save Jews, because he feared this framing would reduce public support for the entire war effort and give ammunition to isolationists and anti-Semites, who were already claiming that America was fighting for Jewish interests rather than for American interests. So Roosevelt made a deliberate choice to downplay the Holocaust in his public statements and to avoid taking dramatic actions that were specifically aimed at rescuing Jews or disrupting the death camps. And it was a political calculation that was, by any moral measure, completely bankrupt. Truman spent the next several days investigating everything he could find about this decision. He called in John McCloy, who served as Assistant Secretary of War and had been directly involved in the decision-making process about whether to bomb Auschwitz. McCloy confirmed everything that Stimson had said, and added even more disturbing details that made the picture even darker. McCloy explained that in June of 1944, The World Jewish Congress had sent a desperate appeal to the War Department, literally begging them to bomb Auschwitz. And the timing was critical, because by that point hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were being transported to Auschwitz and murdered immediately upon their arrival, with the killing happening at an unprecedented pace that shocked even the Nazi administrators running the camp. McCloy had reviewed the request personally and consulted with military planners who specialized in strategic bombing operations. The planners had reached a conclusion that should have changed everything. Bombing Auschwitz was not only feasible, it was actually quite practical given existing Allied operations in the area. American bombers were already conducting regular raids on industrial targets located within just a few miles of Auschwitz, including the IG Farben synthetic oil plant at Auschwitz-Monowitz that was bombed multiple times during August and September of 1944. The bombers flying missions to attack that industrial facility literally flew directly over Auschwitz-Birkenau on their way to and from the target, meaning they could have dropped bombs on the gas chambers and crematoria without taking on any significant additional risk or requiring any meaningful diversion of military resources. But the orders to do so never came down the chain of command. McCloy had actually written a detailed memo to Roosevelt, explaining that bombing Auschwitz was militarily practical and could save a significant number of lives. Roosevelt's response, according to McCloy's painful recollection, was simply to reiterate his position that the best and fastest way to help the victims of Nazi persecution was to win the war as quickly as possible, and that targeting concentration camps specifically was not what he considered an appropriate use of military resources. McCloy admitted to Truman that he personally believed this had been the wrong decision, but Roosevelt was the commander-in-chief, and ultimately the decision was his alone to make. Truman looked McCloy directly in the eyes and asked him a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. How many people died who might have been saved if we had bombed those railway lines or the camps themselves? McCloy looked absolutely miserable as he answered. He told Truman that it was impossible to calculate the number precisely with any real accuracy, but that conservative estimates suggested that disrupting just the transportation system to Auschwitz alone during the summer of 1944 could potentially have saved tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews, and possibly many more than that. The deportations from Hungary were happening so rapidly and on such a massive scale that even temporary disruptions to the railway system would have made a significant difference in the number of people who could be transported to their deaths. Truman felt physically ill listening to this. Tens of thousands of people had died because Roosevelt had decided their lives weren't worth the diversion of a few bombing missions. They had died because Roosevelt was worried about political optics and how Americans might react. They had died because Roosevelt believed that saving Jews specifically might somehow make the war less popular among anti-Semitic Americans. Truman sat there in the Oval Office that Roosevelt had occupied for 12 years and felt a profound sense of moral failure. Not his own failure, but his predecessor's failure, and it shook him to his core. But then Truman discovered something that was somehow even worse than everything he had learned so far. He found correspondence between Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill about this exact issue, and what that correspondence revealed was devastating. In July of 1944, Churchill had received similar appeals from Jewish organizations in Britain, asking him to authorize bombing raids on Auschwitz. Churchill had actually been more sympathetic to these appeals than Roosevelt had been. Churchill had written to his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, with instructions that showed he was willing to act. The exact words Churchill used were, "Get anything out of the Air Force you can, and invoke me if necessary." Churchill was prepared to authorize the bombing operations, but Roosevelt actively discouraged him from doing so. In private communications between the two leaders, Roosevelt had argued that making the Holocaust a specific focus of Allied military operations would create political problems that would complicate the broader war effort. He suggested to Churchill that Britain and America should maintain their focus on defeating Germany as a whole, rather than getting sidetracked by what he characterized as specifically Jewish issues. Churchill, who desperately needed American support and cooperation on countless other strategic and logistical matters, ultimately deferred to Roosevelt's position on this matter. So even when the British might have taken action on their own initiative, Roosevelt's influence and pressure prevented it from happening. Truman decided he needed to speak with Henry Morgenthau Jr., who had served as Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary and was one of the very few high-ranking Jewish officials in the entire Roosevelt administration. When Morgenthau arrived at the White House, he looked exhausted and became visibly emotional as Truman began asking him questions about what he had known and when. Morgenthau proceeded to tell Truman a story that was even more damning than what Stimson and McCloy had revealed. He explained that back in January of 1944, he had personally presented Roosevelt with a report that had been prepared by his staff at the Treasury Department. The report had a title that pulled no punches whatsoever: Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews. This extraordinary document had carefully detailed how the State Department had actively worked to suppress information about the Holocaust and had deliberately blocked various efforts that might have helped rescue Jews from occupied Europe. The report made the explosive argument that the Roosevelt administration was actually complicit in the deaths of Jews through its pattern of inaction and bureaucratic obstruction. Morgenthau had hoped that presenting this devastating report to Roosevelt would shock the president into taking meaningful action to help European Jews. Instead, Roosevelt had read through the report, acknowledged that, yes, there were serious problems in how the government was handling these issues, and then created something called the War Refugee Board to coordinate rescue efforts going forward. But here's what made Morgenthau so angry and frustrated. Roosevelt had deliberately underfunded the board from the very beginning and given it minimal actual authority to accomplish anything significant. It was essentially a public relations gesture designed to make it look like the administration was doing something, rather than a genuine effort to mount serious rescue operations. Morgenthau had felt frustrated and angry about this at the time, but he had also been deeply loyal to Roosevelt personally and professionally, so he had largely kept his criticism private throughout the remainder of the war. Now, with Roosevelt dead and Truman asking direct questions, Morgenthau finally told the complete unvarnished truth about what he had witnessed. He looked at Truman and said that Franklin Roosevelt had been a great man in many ways and had accomplished extraordinary things as president. But on this particular issue, Roosevelt had failed morally in a profound way. Roosevelt had possessed the power to save lives, real human lives, and he had consciously chosen not to use that power. He had made calculations about politics and military strategy, but he had never seemed to seriously consider that maybe, just maybe, some things were more important than political calculations and strategic considerations. Those people dying in the camps weren't abstractions or statistics on a page. They were human beings with names and families and dreams, and the United States could have helped at least some of them, but chose not to. Truman asked Morgenthau a painful question. Why hadn't he resigned from the administration in protest, or gone public with his criticism while Roosevelt was still alive? Morgenthau's answer was brutally honest, and clearly still caused him pain to admit. He said that he had told himself at the time that staying inside the administration and trying to push for change from within would be more effective than resigning in protest and losing whatever influence he had. He had told himself that Roosevelt was doing the best he could under extremely difficult wartime circumstances. He had made excuses for decisions he knew in his heart were wrong, and now he had to live with the fact that he had stayed silent while people were being murdered by the thousands every single day. He looked at Truman and said he wasn't proud of the choice he had made to stay quiet. Truman spent days immersing himself in the documents, studying Roosevelt's annotated map over and over again, tracing his finger along the railway lines that could have been bombed but never were. He read through intelligence reports from 1942 and 1943 that described the death camps in horrifying detail, reports that made it absolutely clear that senior officials in the Roosevelt administration had known exactly what was happening. He read the desperate appeals from Jewish organizations, literally begging for any kind of help, any action that might save even a fraction of the people being killed. He read detailed memos from military planners explicitly stating that bombing Auschwitz was feasible and could be accomplished without major risks or resource diversions. And he read Roosevelt's responses to all of these appeals, every single one of which said no, always no, never yes. Through all of this reading and investigation, Truman came to a fundamental conclusion that would define his entire approach to humanitarian crises for the rest of his presidency. Never again would America have the power to save innocent lives, and choose not to use that power simply because it was politically inconvenient or strategically complicated. But Truman immediately found himself facing a serious dilemma about what he should do with all of this devastating information he had uncovered. Roosevelt had been dead for less than a month at this point. The war in Europe had just ended with Germany's surrender. The entire nation was simultaneously celebrating victory and mourning Roosevelt as a fallen hero who had led America through the Depression and the war. If Truman chose to publicly reveal what he had discovered about Roosevelt's knowledge of the Holocaust and his refusal to take action, it would completely destroy Roosevelt's carefully crafted reputation and would almost certainly create a major political crisis at a time when the country was still at war with Japan and facing enormous challenges in rebuilding Europe. Revealing the truth would also raise profoundly painful questions about American complicity in the Holocaust that Truman wasn't sure the nation was emotionally ready to confront in that moment. After wrestling with this dilemma, Truman made a careful decision about how to handle the situation. He would not publicly expose Roosevelt's failure while the wounds were still so fresh and the country was still processing Roosevelt's death. He would not release the map or the supporting documents showing that Roosevelt had known about the death camps in a detail and had consciously refused to authorize bombing raids that might have disrupted the killing. But Truman also made it clear to himself and to a small circle of trusted advisors that he would not hide the truth or allow it to be buried forever. And he made absolutely certain that future presidents would understand the profound moral cost that comes with choosing inaction when you have the power to save lives. Truman gave orders that the map and all of the related documents should be carefully preserved in a sealed file that would be maintained in the National Archives, with instructions that these materials would eventually be opened when enough time had passed for historians to examine them with some degree of objectivity and historical distance. Even though Truman chose not to make an immediate public revelation, his discovery of Roosevelt's map had a powerful and immediate impact on his own decision-making as president. When the full horror of the Nazi concentration camps was finally revealed to the entire world in April and May of 1945, as Allied troops liberated camp after camp and found emaciated survivors barely clinging to life alongside piles of corpses, Truman was not surprised by what they found. He had already known for weeks that Roosevelt had known about all of this for years. The newsreels and photographs that shocked the American public and people around the world merely confirmed what Truman had already learned from studying Roosevelt's secret map in the quiet of the Oval Office. The existence of that map and what it represented also had a significant influence on Truman's approach to the creation of the State of Israel just a few years later. In 1947 and 1948, as the United Nations debated the partition of Palestine, Truman faced absolutely enormous pressure from the State Department and from his own military advisors not to support the establishment of an independent Jewish state. These advisors argued passionately that supporting a Jewish state would alienate Arab nations throughout the Middle East and would seriously threaten American access to oil resources that were considered vital to national security. The arguments against recognition were practical and strategic, and came from people Truman generally trusted on foreign policy matters. But Truman kept thinking about Roosevelt's map. He kept remembering those railway lines marked in blue ink that could have been bombed but weren't. He kept thinking about the tens of thousands of people who had died while America and its leaders looked the other way and made excuses about why nothing could be done. And Truman decided with absolute certainty that he would not repeat Roosevelt's mistake of allowing political calculations and strategic considerations to override basic moral imperatives about human life and dignity, going directly against the advice of almost his entire foreign policy establishment, including people he respected greatly. Truman officially recognized the State of Israel just 11 minutes after it declared independence on May 14, 1948. When his advisors pressed him and asked why he was taking such a politically risky position that might damage American interests in the Middle East, Truman's response was characteristically blunt and direct. He told them that he had seen personally what happens when political leaders choose political convenience and strategic calculations over doing what is morally right, and he said he absolutely would not do it again, not while he was president. Truman never mentioned Roosevelt's map publicly or talked about it in speeches or press conferences, but the people who were closest to Truman and worked with him most closely knew that discovering that map had profoundly affected his entire way of thinking about Jewish issues, humanitarian interventions, and America's moral responsibilities in the world. The discovery of Roosevelt's map also fundamentally changed how Truman viewed his predecessor's overall legacy as president. Before finding the map in that locked drawer, Truman had been critical of Roosevelt mostly for personal reasons, for how Roosevelt had treated him as vice president, keeping him out of important meetings and decisions, and for the complete lack of preparation Truman had received for assuming the presidency after Roosevelt's death. But the map revealed something much darker than personal slights or poor succession planning. It revealed a moral failure that couldn't be explained away or excused by appeals to political pragmatism or military necessity. Roosevelt had known about the Holocaust in extraordinary detail. He had possessed the military capability to disrupt the killing operations at least partially through strategic bombing, and he had made a conscious choice not to take action that could have saved lives. Truman found this decision absolutely unforgivable, no matter how many other great things Roosevelt had accomplished during his presidency. In private conversations over the years that followed, Truman would occasionally make oblique references to what he had discovered, though he was always very careful never to discuss the details publicly in a way that would damage Roosevelt's reputation. He told his daughter Margaret that her generation and future generations would face difficult questions about what people knew and what they did during the Holocaust. And then he added that he had personally found out that some people in positions of power knew a lot more than they ever publicly admitted, and did far less than they were capable of doing to help. In a conversation with his friend Dean Acheson, who served as Secretary of State, Truman said that Roosevelt had made many great decisions during his time as president, but that he had also made some terrible decisions that he had managed to hide from historical scrutiny by dying before the full consequences of those decisions became clear to the public. The sealed documents that Truman had ordered preserved in the National Archives were eventually opened to researchers in the 1970s and 80s, decades after both Roosevelt and Truman had died. Historians discovered Roosevelt's annotated map with all of its red pins marking death camps and its blue lines showing which railway routes had been bombed and which had been deliberately left alone. They found the correspondence between Roosevelt and Churchill that showed Roosevelt had actively discouraged British action. They located and studied the detailed military feasibility studies that had explicitly concluded bombing Auschwitz could have been done without major difficulties. As more and more of this documentation became available to scholars, the historical consensus gradually began to shift to acknowledge that the Roosevelt administration had indeed failed to take actions during the war that might have saved significant numbers of lives during the Holocaust. This historical reckoning was extremely painful for many Americans who had grown up revering Franklin Roosevelt as an unambiguous hero and one of the greatest presidents in American history. But Truman had understood something important: that historical truth matters more than comfortable myths. Even when the truth is difficult and challenges our heroes, by carefully preserving all of the evidence rather than destroying it to protect Roosevelt's reputation, Truman ensured that future generations of Americans and historians around the world could study what had happened and learn from Roosevelt's failure. The lesson that emerged from those documents was crystal clear. Having the power to save innocent lives creates a moral obligation to use that power, even when using it is politically inconvenient or strategically complicated, or might create diplomatic problems. The map itself, Roosevelt's actual physical map with his own handwritten annotations, with those red pins marking each death camp, and the blue lines showing the railway routes that were bombed and those that were deliberately spared, is now carefully preserved in the Roosevelt Presidential Library in Hyde Park, New York. Researchers who have a legitimate scholarly purpose can request permission to examine it in person, though it's kept in climate-controlled storage because of its age and extraordinary historical significance. Looking at that map today, knowing what each of those small red pins represented, knowing that the railway lines marked in Roosevelt's blue ink could have been bombed but were deliberately left functioning so the trains could keep running to the death camps, is an absolutely sobering experience for anyone who sees it. It stands as a physical artifact, made of paper and ink and pins, that documents a profound moral failure by one of America's greatest and most admired presidents. Throughout his own presidency and even after he left office, Truman never publicly criticized Roosevelt for this particular failure in any direct or explicit way. He maintained the sense of decorum and respect that was expected in communications between presidents, past and present. But the people who knew Truman well and spent significant time with him understood that the discovery of Roosevelt's secret map had fundamentally and permanently changed how Truman viewed his predecessor as both a president and as a man. Truman believed deeply that great leaders who face horrible choices and impossible situations have a special obligation to choose morality and human decency over political expediency and strategic calculation. Roosevelt had faced exactly that kind of choice when he learned about the Holocaust and was presented with options for how to respond. And in Truman's judgment, Roosevelt had failed that crucial test of moral leadership. Truman spent his entire presidency, from that moment in May 1945 when he discovered the map until he left office in January 1953, trying to ensure that he would never make the same kind of mistake Roosevelt had made, that he would never allow political convenience or strategic considerations to prevent him from taking action when human lives hung in the balance. The story of Roosevelt's secret map raises questions that remain deeply uncomfortable and profoundly relevant even today, decades after these events took place. When leaders and governments know about atrocities being committed, and have the military or economic or diplomatic power to intervene in some meaningful way, what is their moral obligation to act? At what point does political pragmatism and strategic calculation cross the line and become simple moral cowardice dressed up in the language of realism? How should leaders balance immediate humanitarian concerns and the imperative to save lives right now against broader strategic goals and longer-term considerations about winning wars and maintaining alliances? These questions don't have simple answers or easy solutions, and reasonable people can disagree about where exactly the line should be drawn in any particular situation. But Truman's discovery of Roosevelt's map serves as a powerful reminder that how leaders choose to answer these fundamental questions when they're faced with them often defines their historical legacy more than almost anything else they do while in office. Harry Truman found Franklin Roosevelt's secret map on May 3, 1945, in a locked drawer in the Oval Office. What that map revealed, with its red pins and blue lines and careful annotations in Roosevelt's own handwriting, made Truman physically sick to his stomach. It showed him that his predecessor had known about the Holocaust in extraordinary detail, had possessed the military capability to disrupt the Nazi killing operations, at least partially through strategic bombing of railways and camps, and had made a calculated decision not to take action that could have saved lives. This knowledge didn't just shock Truman, it fundamentally shaped his entire approach to the presidency and his understanding of what moral leadership required. It taught him that good intentions and sophisticated political calculations don't excuse inaction when you have the power to prevent mass murder. It taught him that possessing power, whether military or economic or diplomatic, creates profound moral responsibilities that can't be avoided or explained away. And perhaps most importantly, it taught him that sometimes the hardest and most important thing a leader has to do is act on principle and moral conviction, even when doing so is politically costly and strategically complicated and might create serious problems with allies or domestic constituencies. These were the lessons that Roosevelt's secret map taught to Harry Truman during those dark days in May 1945, and they remain vitally relevant lessons for leaders and citizens today, as we continue to face questions about intervention, about moral responsibility, and about what we owe to innocent people suffering under oppressive regimes. The map still exists, carefully preserved in a climate-controlled archive, a silent witness to choices made and choices not made, to lives that might have been saved and lives that were lost, to the terrible weight of power and the eternal question of how that power should be used when human beings are dying and asking for help.